The net flow of long-term capital from the rich to the poor is not increasing. OECD has estimated that in 1961, the net flow, including the cost of technical assistance of official and private capital, was $9.2 billion, that it dropped to $8.3 billion in 1963, but rose in 1965 to $10 billion. The flow of official capital, which reflects better the policies of governments, has scarcely changed over this period, moving only from $6.1 billion to $6.4 billion. And in commitments in 1965 were actually $1.6 billion less than in 1964. None of these figures has been adjusted for price changes. It is probable that the 1965 flow would not in fact buy more investment goods than the 1961 flow. During this same period, the terms of trade have deteriorated. Populations have grown, and the terms of loans have hardened, all of which have reduced the value to developing countries of the 1965 flow as compared with the 1961 flow. The flows are disappointing also in terms of the target of 1% of gross national product in the advanced countries. In this respect, the net official flow has fallen from 0.6% in 1961 to 0.49% in 1965. But the full picture is even worse than this. The figures reported by OECD are net of repayments of principal and the repatriation of capital, but no account has been taken of other reverse flows of capital, such as investment in industrial countries by residents of developing countries and interest and dividend payments. The outlook, when these factors are taken into account, has been stated very clearly by Mr. Woods of the World Bank. These payments are continuing to rise at an accelerating rate, and in a little more than 15 years, on present form would offset the inflow completely. In short, to go on doing what the capital exploiting countries are now doing will in not the too long run amount to doing nothing at all. Let's face it, the developing countries are in the greatest danger of not developing at all. Hampered by bare subsistent level incomes, domestic capital can scarcely be accumulated, even with the strictest of taxation measures. Hampered by bare subsistent level incomes, domestic capital can scarcely be accumulated, even with the strictest of taxation measures, at a rate sufficient to maintain per capita incomes in the face of growing populations. The prospect that foreign capital may dry up occurs at the time when the wealthy nations are achieving unprecedented rates of growth. Indeed, it is not unlikely that per capita income for the whole of the rich world may double over the next 30 years from $1,800 to $3,600 per annum. Even astounding success in the very poor countries could not narrow this gap. Increasing incomes by 10 times from $90 to $900 would still mean that 30 years hence, the gap would be $2,700 as compared with $1,710 today. But to be threatened with no growth at all is intolerable. The shrinkage of foreign capital is already having a number of undesirable side effects. First, spheres of influence from which all newly independent nations want to escape are instead continuing and indeed in many cases becoming more clearly defined. Declining aid means that bilateral sources are becoming more and more selective in determining the countries which should be privileged to receive it. After all, a friends first policy is not illogical so long as the bulk of aid is bilateral in nature. The obvious pressure on the developing nations to choose or suffer is regrettable but real. Second, the developing nations themselves, finding their joint efforts to increase total aid unavailing, are being reduced to scrambling, competitively and ignominiously for the limited funds that are available. When country A gets a soft loan from the International Development Association, everyone knows that there is less for the rest. Finally, declining funds means that all aid negotiations and preliminary red tape are prolonged, perhaps simply to keep the corps of experts busy, possibly to make the shortage of funds less apparent. The growing complexity of aid negotiations, some of which are beyond the means of developing countries to cope with, is also contributing to an apparent ambivalence towards foreign capital among developing countries. The stark reality of the need for foreign capital is opposed by the irritation for bargaining for it, the frustration of growing numbers of refusals, and the increasing external supervision which at times borders on interference in domestic affairs. The ambivalence is therefore, and to an increasing extent, the mere reflection of the scarcity of foreign capital and the onerous terms on which it can be obtained. This dire outlook is only hardened when one notes the growing hostility to foreign aid in the advanced countries, when aid is not received with the appropriate degree of humility and gratitude. That fact is noted in political forums everywhere. The priority accorded aid is reduced, and it frequently is given the status of a sacrificial lamb, something to be given up whenever other problems arise. Thus, aid, much of which must be a long-term commitment to be effective, is curtailed as a means of alleviating short-term balance of payments problems, even though these problems are largely as the result of dealings among the developed nations themselves. Aid may be cut if recessions threaten, wars escalate, or political parties change power. Thus, aid becomes unstable and an impossible basis for planning. Its effectiveness is considerably reduced. The growing hostility towards aid also reinforces the attitude that aid should be tied to direct imports, even though at higher than world market prices, to quality standards, even though they make no sense in a poor country, to glamour projects, even though these are of marginal value to development, and to political support, even though the support is not genuine.